Imagine walking into a quiet library in the year 1888. A leather tanner named John Loud is working on a thick piece of rough cowhide. He needs to write a note on the leather, so he reaches for his fountain pen. He presses the sharp metal nib against the hide, but nothing happens. The ink refuses to stick. In frustration, he tries a pencil, but the graphite breaks immediately. John Loud decides to solve this problem himself. He builds a small, strange instrument with a tiny rolling steel ball locked inside a socket. When he rolls it over the rough leather, the ball turns, picks up ink from a chamber inside, and leaves a clear line. John Loud had just invented the world's very first ballpoint pen. It sounded like a perfect design. Yet, if you had walked into a store 50 years later to buy one, you wouldn't have found it anywhere. John Loud's brilliant idea was completely forgotten, and he died without making a single penny from it. To understand why a tool used by billions of people today was abandoned for half a century, we have to look at a massive problem that plagued humanity for hundreds of years. The world was desperately trying to write, but the tools available were absolute nightmares. For centuries, people wrote with quill pens made from goose feathers. They were noisy, fragile, and required constant sharpening with a knife. By the 19th century, metal fountain pens replaced feathers. They were a massive upgrade, but they created a whole new set of miserable problems. Fountain pens relied on liquid ink flowing through a tiny split in a metal nib. If the ink was too thin, it exploded out of the pen, leaving giant dark stains on clothes, documents, and hands. If the ink was too thick, it dried up inside the tube, clogging the pen forever. Writing a single letter meant living in constant fear of a sudden ink explosion. Businessmen carried extra shirts to work, and students routinely walked home with hands stained deep blue. Engineers across Europe and America knew that whoever could create a leak-proof, smooth-writing pen would become rich beyond imagination. Between 1880 and 1930, the patent offices in Washington, London, and Paris received over 300 different designs for ballpoint pens. Some inventors created pens with tiny springs inside to push the ink forward. Others built complex pump systems. One eccentric inventor even patented a pen with a tiny liquid heating element inside to keep the ink warm. Every single one of these inventions failed. The reason was always the same. No one could figure out the physics of liquid. If the ink was liquid enough to flow around a rotating ball, gravity pulled it straight out of the tip, making the pen leak everywhere. But if the ink was thick enough not to leak, it stuck to the inside of the barrel and wouldn't roll onto the paper. The world was stuck in a sticky, messy trap. Then, a Hungarian journalist named László Bíró got tired of ruining his own work. In the 1930s, Bíró was working as a newspaper editor in Budapest. Every single day, he spent hours writing articles with a fountain pen. He hated every second of it. The pen constantly scratched his paper, left huge blobs, and took forever to dry. One afternoon, Bíró walked down to the basement of the newspaper building to watch the massive printing presses in action. He noticed something fascinating. The ink used for printing newspapers was extremely thick and sticky, almost like tar. Yet, as the giant metal rollers turned, the ink transferred onto the paper smoothly, drying almost instantly without smudging. Bíró had an epiphany. What if he used newspaper ink inside a fountain pen? He rushed home, filled an old fountain pen with thick printing press ink, and tried to write. It was a complete disaster. The thick ink refused to flow down the thin tube. It stuck to the sides and dried solid within minutes, permanently ruining his pen. That was the moment László Bíró remembered the forgotten rolling ball design from decades earlier. He realized that a fountain pen couldn't push thick ink, but a rotating ball could. The ball would act like a tiny version of the newspaper printing press, scooping up thick ink from inside the chamber and rolling it smoothly onto the page. László turned to his brother, Georgi, who happened to be a brilliant chemist. Together, the two brothers turned their kitchen into a secret laboratory. They faced a nightmare of engineering. The steel ball at the tip of the pen had to be microscopic, perfectly round, and fitted inside a metal socket with a gap smaller than a human hair. If the gap was off by even a fraction of a millimeter, the pen would either leak uncontrollably or jam completely. Georgi spent months mixing bizarre concoctions of oils, dyes, and resins, trying to create the ultimate writing fluid. It had to be thick enough to stay inside the chamber without dripping, but slippery enough to coat the rolling steel ball. After years of relentless trial and error, they did it. In 1938, the Bíró brothers filed a patent in Hungary for a functional ballpoint pen. It wrote smoothly, dried instantly, and never leaked. It seemed like the brothers were on the verge of incredible wealth and global fame. Instead, their lives were about to be turned upside down by one of the darkest moments in human history. As the late 1930s arrived, World War II swept across Europe. The Bíró brothers were Jewish, and staying in Hungary was becoming increasingly dangerous as Nazi influence expanded. Their dream of manufacturing their pen dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. They needed to escape Europe, but leaving the continent during a global war was nearly impossible. They needed a miracle, and it arrived in the most unexpected way imaginable. A few years earlier, while vacationing at a resort in Yugoslavia, László Bíró had been sitting by a hotel pool writing a letter with his prototype pen. A friendly, well-dressed older gentleman stopped to watch him. The stranger was fascinated by the strange device that wrote effortlessly without an ink bottle. The man introduced himself, chatted with László about the invention, and gave him a handwritten card saying, "If you ever need help, come see me in South America." That stranger was Agustín Pedro Justo, the president of Argentina. With Europe collapsing around them, the Bíró brothers remembered the president's invitation. Using the president's letter, they managed to secure visas, escape Europe on a boat, and land safely in Buenos Aires in 1940. They arrived with almost no money, limited Spanish, and a single suitcase containing their metal pen prototypes. In Argentina, they found an investor and set up a small factory in an old garage. They worked 18-hour days, assembling pens by hand. But when they launched their first commercial model, called the Bíróm, it was a total commercial flop. The pens were far too expensive, costing the modern equivalent of over $50 each. Worse, the design still relied on gravity to push the ink toward the ball. If a user held the pen at a sharp angle, the ink stopped flowing. Sales plummeted, money ran out, and the factory was on the brink of bankruptcy. That should have been the end of the story. But once again, war intervened. While the Bíró brothers were struggling in Argentina, the Allied forces were fighting a high-altitude air war over Europe. British and American pilots were flying massive bomber planes at altitudes above 20,000 feet. Up in the freezing, low-pressure atmosphere of the sky, military navigators had a critical problem. They needed to calculate flight paths, fuel consumption, and target coordinates on paper maps. But standard fountain pens were completely useless at high altitudes. The atmospheric pressure inside the plane dropped, causing the air bubbles trapped inside fountain pen ink barrels to expand violently. Mid-flight, thousands of fountain pens exploded simultaneously, spraying black ink over critical maps, instruments, and pilot uniforms. Pencils were tried, but their lead points snapped easily under heavy air turbulence, sending sharp graphite floating into sensitive cockpit electronics. The British Air Ministry issued an urgent request to scientists and inventors: find a writing tool that functions high in the air without exploding. A British businessman named Henry Martin happened to be visiting South America when he encountered the Bíróm. He instantly recognized its military potential. Because the ballpoint pen used thick, viscous ink held tight in a narrow capillary tube, it didn't rely on atmospheric pressure. It could write in sub-zero temperatures, at high altitudes, and even upside down. Martin bought the patent rights for the British government. The Royal Air Force immediately ordered 30,000 ballpoint pens for their bomber crews. Virtually overnight, the humble ballpoint pen went from a failing Argentine novelty to a top-secret military tool. Allies used it to navigate missions, sign operational orders, and write letters back home from the cockpit. When American soldiers saw their British counterparts using these magic pens that never leaked, curiosity exploded. Returning soldiers brought story after story back to the United States about a legendary pen that could write underwater, on wet paper, and in the clouds. American business magnates realized that a massive market was waiting. The moment World War II ended in 1945, the floodgates opened, unleashing one of the most chaotic, ruthless corporate wars in history. If you are enjoying this deep dive into history and want to improve your English while learning incredible stories, make sure to subscribe to Origin Stories. We share hidden chapters of history every week. Now, back to our story. An ambitious American entrepreneur named Milton Reynolds was traveling in Buenos Aires right as the war ended. He spotted a Bírome in a shop window, bought a few samples, and flew straight back to Chicago. Reynolds knew that the Bíró brothers held international patents, but he found a legal loophole. He realized that John Loud's original 1888 American patent had expired decades ago, putting the basic ballpoint concept into the public domain. Reynolds made a few minor tweaks to the internal feeder mechanism and bypassed László Bíró's patent entirely. Reynolds rushed his design into mass production, aiming to be the first person to sell a ballpoint pen to the American public. On October 29, 1945, the famous Gimbel's department store in New York City announced that it was selling the very first American ballpoint pen, the Reynolds Rocket. The scene outside the store was absolute madness. Over 5,000 eager people lined up in the freezing rain before the doors even opened. Police officers had to be called to control the massive crowds pushing through the entrance. People were screaming, shoving, and waving cash over their heads. The Reynolds Rocket was priced at $12.50, which is equivalent to roughly $200 today for a single pen. Despite the absurd price tag, Gimbel's sold out its entire stock of 10,000 pens in less than 6 hours. In its first month, the store made over $800,000 in sales. Milton Reynolds had become a multimillionaire overnight. It sounded like a legendary business success story. It wasn't. Within weeks, the dream turned into a nightmare. The Reynolds Rocket was a terribly rushed, defective product. The ink leaked out of the sides, staining suit pockets, leather purses, and wooden desks. The ink contained a cheap chemical solvent that ate directly through paper, leaving permanent holes in important business contracts. Thousands of furious customers marched back to Gimbel's, demanding full refunds. Lawsuits rained down on Reynolds from every direction. At the same time, rival companies flooded the market with their own cheap copies, sparking a brutal price war. Within 2 years, the retail price of a ballpoint pen crashed from $12 down to 19 cents. Companies went bankrupt, factories closed, and the public came to view the ballpoint pen as a trashy, unreliable scam. László Bíró, watching from Argentina, received almost no royalties from the American sales frenzy. Overwhelmed by corporate legal battles, he sold his remaining patent rights and retired from the pen business, turning his attention back to painting and inventing small engine components. By 1950, it looked as though the ballpoint pen was dead for a second time. But across the Atlantic Ocean, a quiet French aristocrat was watching the industry collapse with intense fascination. His name was Marcel Biche. Biche was the co-founder of a small factory outside Paris that produced fountain pen parts. Unlike Milton Reynolds, who wanted to make a quick fortune with a rushed product, Marcel Biche was an absolute perfectionist, obsessed with precision manufacturing. He believed the ballpoint pen failed in America not because the concept was bad, but because the manufacturing quality was terrible. Biche spent 2 years studying the microscopic mechanics of the pen tip. He invested millions of francs in high-precision Swiss watchmaking machinery, capable of cutting metal down to a single micron. He experimented with dozens of tungsten carbide alloys to create a tiny ball that would never wear down or deform. In December 1950, Marcel Biche launched his masterpiece in France. A clear, hexagonal plastic pen with a brass tip, a tungsten ball, and a tiny hole drilled into the side to equalize internal air pressure. He shortened his own name to make it easier for people to remember and pronounce worldwide. He called the product the BIC Cristal. BIC did something revolutionary. Instead of selling the pen as a luxury item like Reynolds had done, he sold it for just 2 cents. He advertised it as a throwaway item, a pen so cheap you could lose it without caring, yet so reliable it would write smoothly for over 2 kilometers without skipping a single line. The BIC Cristal completely transformed society. For the first time in human history, writing became accessible to every human being on Earth, regardless of wealth or class. Before the BIC pen, a reliable writing instrument was an expensive tool reserved for politicians, scholars, and wealthy professionals. After 1950, anyone, a poor student, a factory worker, or a child, could afford a perfect tool to record their thoughts. Schools that had banned ballpoint pens for decades, claiming they would ruin students' handwriting, finally gave in and adopted them. Literacy rates shot up globally as cheap writing materials flooded developing nations. Today, the BIC Cristal is the best-selling pen in human history. Over 100 billion of them have been manufactured. If you lined up all the BIC pens ever sold, they would loop around the Earth more than 100 times. The design is so iconic that it sits permanently in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. When we look closely at a simple plastic pen sitting on a desk, we rarely think about its chaotic journey. We don't think about John Loud trying to mark a piece of cowhide in 1888. We don't think about the Bíró brothers fleeing Europe with a prototype hidden in their luggage, or bomber pilots struggling with exploding ink thousands of feet above the clouds, or thousands of screaming shoppers mobbing a department store in Manhattan. The ballpoint pen is a powerful reminder that the objects that shape human civilization the most are rarely the flashy ones. Sometimes, the most revolutionary inventions are the quiet, everyday things we take for granted. The tiny tools that allow us to share our ideas, tell our stories, and leave our mark on the world. What surprised you the most about this story? Let me know in the comments below, and check out another hidden chapter of history on our channel.